Good afternoon. A happy Spiritual Baptist Liberation Day to our spiritual Baptist brothers and sisters, and by extension, the country of Trinidad and Tobago, on behalf of the Board of Directors and staff at the Emancipation Support Committee. Today, we bring you a very insightful presentation entitled The Spiritual Baptist Struggle for Liberation from Prohibition to Repeal by Dr. Claudius Fergus, the Director of Education Research here at the Emancipation Support Committee. We do hope that you enjoy the presentation, and please leave your questions in the comment section below.
Happy Liberation Day to the spiritual Baptist community around the world. I want to share a few thoughts from my research on the political and judicial aspects of the spiritual Baptist struggle for repeal of the Prohibition ordinances, which began in St. Vincent in 1912 and ended in St. Vincent in 1965. Believe it or not, the ordinance is still on the statute books of Grenada to this day. Nevertheless, I have titled my presentation From Prohibition to Repeal, Some Insights into the Judicial and Legal Aspects of the Spiritual Baptist Struggle for Liberation. Few scholars pay much attention to the political and judicial components of the struggle. In the three colonies of religious persecution of the spiritual Baptists, that is in Grenada, Trinidad and Tobago, and St. Vincent, TNT was the first to have their freedom to worship restored by law. Much of the reason for this is the changing nature of Crown Colony constitutionalism. It had absolutely nothing to do with a desire by the British government to finally uphold the rights of spiritual Baptists to worship according to conscience, as guaranteed, of course, under the Toleration Acts, which the same British government considered to have constitutional authority across the empire. Furthermore, in the 1930s, when it seemed like a majority of legislative councillors in St. Vincent might vote for repeal, the colonial secretary instructed the governor of the Windward Islands to veto that decision should it happen. The Prohibition Ordinance was actually a stratagem in the politics of colonial white supremacy. The immediate guardians of that white supremacy were the magistrates. Under Section 8 of the ordinances, and all of them were almost carbon copies of each other, magistrates had summary powers to dismiss any case, or impose a fine or imprisonment on an accused person. And there was no appeal whatsoever from their judgment. But the magistrates had no power to annul the law. And although they could have pointed out its constitutionality, they didn't. In fact, the Chief Justice was a member of the legislature at that time, advising administrators and governors to proceed with prohibition. What an abuse of power. Without recourse to legal counsel until the late 1940s, spiritual Baptists were sitting ducks in these kangaroo courts. But they fought back with their faith. And I will cite just two what I call famous examples. The case of Teacher Bailey is well known in Trinidad. Just 2 months after the passage of the Prohibition Ordinance in 1917, Teacher Bailey and 13 of his congregation were arrested during worship right next to a police station in Perseverance Village in central Trinidad. They were the law's first victims, and the law had even been sanctioned by the colonial office. It had not been sanctioned by the colonial office. But that was not a problem in the colonial context. But I'm just noting that fact that the law was not even sanctioned yet. Now, Bailey appeared in court, impressively dressed in the regalia befitting the office of teacher. And of course, teacher is one of the higher and very esteemed positions within the Spiritual Baptist administrative order. He was wearing a white head tie, a cross pressed against his chest, and a huge Bible wrapped in red cloth. Of course, colors have special significance to the Spiritual Baptist, which I'm not going to deal with. The drama, to me, was unquestionably a political act of civil disobedience, because over 200 supporters had gone to the court to give moral support to the accused. When asked to plead guilty or not guilty, Bailey responded, and I quote, "I will answer only such a question if it comes from Christ and not from any man," end of quote. The magistrate dismissed the case against the worshippers except Bailey, who was fined but refused to pay. In 1939, the police arrested 40 Shakers in Barley in St. Vincent, that's on the leeward side, about the center of the island, but on the leeward coastal area there. When they appeared in court, they got the spirit, which is an expression used at the time, and indulged in some shaking, another expression associated with spiritual Baptist worship. And they did so in the court before the magistrate, who simply cautioned them and dismissed all the charges. In both examples, in my opinion, their faith had done for them what no lawyer had ever come forward to do for them. The very first time that the spiritual Baptists were privileged with legal counsel was 1948, when Milton Cato in St. Vincent represented a group of 25 spiritual Baptists, who were, of course, called Shakers up to that time. But even then, they had been changing identities, you know. In St. Vincent, they called themselves spiritual Baptists, then they called themselves Pilgrims, and older name converted Christians as well. Now, Cato won a resounding victory by exposing the considerable flaws in the law, which was deliberately written that way to give liberty to the police and the magistrates to persecute the spiritual Baptists according to their own prejudices. Anyone not being a lawyer looking at that specific piece of legislation can discern these flaws. They are inserted into the legislation not because of carelessness, but because the government wanted to leave open the interpretation of what was in fact a violation of certain clauses within the Act. The battle for repeal in the Legislative Council, as the colonial parliament was then called, began in the 1930s. St. Vincent had an advantage over Trinidad in that the 5 elected representatives from the 1937 elections were all pro-repealers, who were led by George McIntosh. McIntosh was of African Scottish extraction. The other 5 members comprising the Legislative Council were non-elected and expected to support the government. In April 1939, McIntosh gave notice, written notice to the administrator of his intention to introduce a motion which read, and I quote, that government be requested to repeal the Shakerism Prohibition Ordinance, Chapter 172 of the 1st of October 1912, and so on, end of quote. McIntosh was obviously well informed on the freedom of conscience enshrined in the British Constitution, because in his opening arguments, he correctly asserted that the Prohibition Ordinance would not have been passed by the present council. Now, that was a clear indictment of the Crown Colony system of government for its systematic failure to protect the most vulnerable subjects from political malice and abuse of power by the white oligarchy. McIntosh further informed the council, I quote, under the British Constitution, people had the right to serve God in whatever manner they pleased, end of quote. Remarkably, the motion succeeded 6-4, when one non-official, Alexander Fraser, crossed the floor, so to speak, and voted with the elected officials. After waiting several months for the government to bring a bill to give effect to the motion, McIntosh took the initiative and drafted his own bill. Now, I do not know if McIntosh was a practicing spiritual Baptist or a closet spiritual Baptist, or no Baptist at all. But he did allow his home in Kingston to be used for spiritual Baptist meetings. McIntosh's bill was stillborn because in the interim, Fraser had crossed back to the safety of the government side, leaving McIntosh without a majority. But even if the bill had passed, the colonial office had already instructed the governor to veto it. Studies on the spiritual Baptist struggle have put too much emphasis on the leadership of elected councillors while treating the spiritual Baptists as more beneficiaries of progressive politics. The real story is a bit more nuanced than that and a lot more in favor of spiritual Baptist agency in their own liberation. But let's step back a bit before adult suffrage. In 1937, George McIntosh and his chief ally in the Legislative Council, Ebenezer Duncan, represented constituencies with strong Shaker or spiritual Baptist congregations. But remember, the spiritual Baptists could not vote in these elections. However, the alignment of councillors with spiritual Baptists assured them the prestige of being men of the people. In other words, it made them popular. With adult suffrage, the Baptists suddenly became a major political force in several constituencies. In Trinidad and Tobago, the spiritual Baptist alignment with political leaders did not begin with Dr. Eric Williams and the PNM in 1956, as many believe. Rather, it began in 1946 with Albert Gomes, leader of the United Front Party, and with Tubal Uriah Bus Butler and his Home Rule Party. We have already seen that this process began earlier in St. Vincent with Charles McIntosh in 1937. Interestingly, Gomes was born in Belmont, which was a stronghold of spiritual Baptists. It was the only place that was actually named in the Prohibition Ordinance of 1917, and that tells you something. Butler had his own Baptist church in Fyzabad, so you see the kind of connections we are drawing there. Under the 1949 Responsible Government Constitution of Trinidad and Tobago, the number of electoral seats expanded to 18, which completely overwhelmed the 5 nominated unofficials, as they were called, and 3 ex officio members. For the first time, ministerial government would comprise elected members. This was a writing on the wall for Prohibition. In 1950, the first general elections under this new constitution dramatically expanded the Repeal Party in the Legislative Council. Many successful candidates had contested seats, as I said, with well-known shouter congregations. Now, Gomes had migrated to Maraval in 1947, but he still ran for Port of Spain North with its Belmont Baptist enclaves. Butler was politically wiser in 1950. Of course, in 1946, he decided to fight Albert Gomes for the Port of Spain North seat, and he lost very badly. And this time, he opted for the safe seat in St. Patrick West. His party romped home with 6 seats and 22% of the votes, by far the largest of all the parties, but still only 1/3 of the total elected seats. Of the 12 other candidates, 2 independents threw their weight behind Butler. Now, McLean, one of the new candidates in Victoria North, you have Ashford Synonan in Victoria South and Chankamaraj in St. Joseph. Now, the two Victoria candidates won with less than 350 votes combined. That tells you that the electorate, the actual voting was quite small. It does not say that the population was small. Within these constituencies, however, were the company villages of Princestown, Moruga, the oldest shelter enclaves in the country. Some people might say this was American country. And of course, for those who don't know, the Americans were the first Baptists to arrive in Trinidad from North America. That's another story we can look at another time. Butler, who had previously been charged with treason and held in a local detention camp throughout World War II, was still a marked man by imperial watchdogs. Governor Hubert Rance considered Butler still too militant, too uncompromising, and too nationalistic to entrust the new office of chief minister. Accordingly, he selected Gomes for that historic role. Gomes's party was backed by the merchant and plantation elites and had won only 2 seats, with just 3%, 3.4%, somewhere around there, of their total votes. Now, all things being equal, Butler would have been asked to lead the government, but colonialism was never about equality. Governor Rance completed Butler's humiliation by denying any member of his party a seat on the executive council. But that did not derail a repeal, and we will see why. Now, it was definitely not the governor's plan, but in appointing Gomes, the conservative politician, to slow down the march towards independence, the governor had to reconcile with the fact that he was also appointing the parliamentary leader of the repeal movement, at least the parliamentary leader from 1946. The bill for repeal of the Shelters Prohibition Ordinance of 1917 was laid before the council in March 1951, just 6 months after the general elections. In the debate that followed, Ashford Sinanan issued the strongest indictment of the British lawmakers. He said, and I quote, "I believe, sir, that it would be extremely difficult for one to find in this island a piece of legislation which turned out to be a greater assault on the liberty and freedom of the individual, or to a greater infringement of the religious rights and freedom of the people," end of quote. As a fitting corollary, Chanka Maraj, the representative for St. Joseph, appealed directly to Chief Minister Albert Gomes to support his call for financial reparations for the spiritual Baptists. Maraj recognized that without material reparations, the Repeal Act would not erase the injustice of decades of persecution, stigmatization, and cultural stagnation. Grant the Baptist people money as other denominations to run their religion, he pleaded with the Speaker of the House. Maraj's call was directed at the colonial government. The Metropolitan government, however, did not only sanction the original ordinances, but also reaffirmed the need to continue with the prohibition some years later. The reparations demand should therefore, in my opinion, be directed to the British government as well, perhaps even more so. And I have made that case before publicly. I am making it again. The spiritual Baptists deserve reparations for the injustices that have been perpetrated against them from 1912 in St. Vincent to 1965. The repeal bill passed the legislature unanimously. So we need to know that point. It was not a case of Gomes versus Butler. It was a case of the government against injustice in the land. This is what it was about. Too many councillors had depended on the Baptist vote to win their seats. And that's a key point. It's the key point that I'm making in this talk. They had depended on the Baptist vote. Therefore, the governor could not high-handedly veto the passage of the bill, particularly since Gomes himself was at the center of the repeal movement. Now, Gomes could not buck the Belmontites. I would like to know the Belmont people call themselves. I am saying Belmontites. He could not do that and expect to win the next general elections. So it was all about politics. The results of the 1956 general elections proves this point. When the spiritual Baptists threw their weight behind the new political messiah, Dr. Eric Williams, what happened? With Dr. Williams contesting the Port of Spain South seat and his party member Ulrich Lee contesting against Gomes in the neighboring Port of Spain North seat, Gomes did not have a ghost of a chance. He lost. Just as the governments in colonies which lacked spiritual Baptist congregations had acted in concert and with urgency to ban the spiritual Baptist religion, one would have expected the governor of the Windward Islands to instruct the administrators in St. Vincent and Grenada to follow the same path with some degree of urgency. But this was not to be. The spiritual Baptists in St. Vincent had to wait another 14 years for the governor to finally end the charade of protecting the national community from the influence of the spiritual Baptists. The masses in St. Vincent were conceded the right to vote for the first time in the 1951 general elections. A new political force was on the scene, the 8th Army of Liberation Party, founded by George Charles. His main ally was Ebenezer Duncan. Ebenezer Duncan was in the Legislative Council prior to 1951. So I need to get that clear. It was Ebenezer Joshua. At various times between 1941 and 1951, both Charles and Joshua had lived in Trinidad. And I like to make that connection. You have a movement of Baptists between Grenada, Trinidad, and St. Vincent from the very beginning of the spiritual Baptist religion as we know it to be called the Shouter and Shaker Baptist. That is an interesting nexus that I think I will explore some other time. Charles actually won a local government seat in Diego Martin in Trinidad, but Joshua lost the San Fernando seat in 1950 with a home rule party, that is Butler's party, ticket. George Charles's preeminence in the Legislative Council as leader of the 8th Army was fatal to the repeal movement. He failed to carry the repeal baton that McIntosh had ceded to him. Had he accepted the challenge to walk in McIntosh's shoes, he could have upheld the Shouters repeal ordinance a few months earlier as a moral catalyst to advance the repeal of the Shakers ordinance, but he did nothing. The reasons are relevant, but I don't think necessary to engage in this discussion. In 1953, following the breakup of the 8th Army, Joshua founded the People's Political Party, the PPP. His party was the only one again contesting the 1954 elections, but Joshua did not emerge as undisputed leader in the Legislative Council. The PPP captured only 3 seats to the independents' 5. Nevertheless, Joshua wasted no time in bringing a resolution for repeal of the Prohibition Ordinance in August of 1955. The bill passed unanimously, but unknowing to Joshua, the colonial office had already checkmated him by strategically appointing Sir Colville Deverell governor of the Windward Islands just 7 months prior to the resolution. Deverell stunned the legislative body and vetoed the resolution. Ironically, and sadly for the spiritual Baptists of St. Vincent, after serving for just 2 years, former Governor Sir Edward Beetham was transferred from the Windward Islands to the newly free religious environment of Trinidad and Tobago. Now, governments generally serve 5-year terms. So it's really a matter of questioning whether this movement was mere coincidence or a strategic move by the colonial office to blunt the progress of the spiritual Baptist liberation movement in the Caribbean. Again, that's something I have to explore a little bit more. In 1956, Joshua became his country's first chief minister. As head of government, however, he prioritized institutional, infrastructural, and economic policies and programs, leaving repeal on the back burner. This was unlike the approach taken by Gomes, but the difference is understandable. As long as Deverell was governor, there was little chance of repeal getting on the statute books. One gray area still for me, however, to investigate is why Joshua waited 5 years after the departure of Deverell to bring his bill to the legislature. Nevertheless, the early 1960s was rife with civil rights militancy in the United States, the rapid decolonization of Africa, also in Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago, with Barbados next in line. Daily news of these events filtered into St. Vincent via television, radio, and the press. Against that revolutionary backdrop, Joshua drafted a new bill for repeal in 1965. In introducing the bill, Joshua pulled no punches, and he was an extreme radical progressive politician. He described the council that passed the Prohibition Ordinance in 1912, quote, a certain ignorant section of the inhabitants of the colony, end quote. Now, it's interesting, those words were exactly the same thing that the white oligarchy used against the Shakers when they passed the ordinance. Whereas McIntosh had disguised the race factor in Prohibition, Joshua unequivocally identified racism as the primary motive of the framers of the 1912 ordinance. In his presentation of the bill, he asked rhetorically, quote, are we going to allow in this golden age that racial paragraph on our statute book when we are not only asking for independence, but responsible government? End of quote. The bill passed unanimously in the Legislative Council. At this time, it received the sanction of the administrator, and the post of governor of Windward Islands actually no longer existed. The restoration of the right to worship was not the end of racial discrimination against the spiritual Baptists. For example, the repeal bills did not include the right to act as marriage officers, but that's another chapter for another time. Please leave your comments and questions.